Everything okay, Zeke? We're very, very proud tonight to have Naosherwan Nalavala. Nalavala. Started off perfect, right? Nalavala. We always know you as Naosherwan Anzar, but that's a pen name. And so I didn't even really know what your family name was until I started preparing for this meeting. And Naosherwan has been with Baba for all of his 58 years. Most of us came to Baba in one way or another, but in Naosherwan's case, Baba came to him. And when he was 2 months old, bounced him on his knee, and etc. I think we're going to hear some of these wonderful stories, not only about Naosherwan, but about his family, who had a kind of access to Meher Baba and a kind of interaction with him that very, very few people, even among his close lovers, East or West, had the privilege to have. And the more I read about Naosherwan's life, chiefly through Lord Meher, the more interested I became, and the more I looked forward to this meeting. Thank you very much for coming, Naosh.
Thank you.
And we have some distinguished guests this evening. We thank you for coming and welcome you. And if you don't mind, Naosh, I'd like to start out just by reading a little snippet of something that I found in Lord Meher. And it goes back to November 1946, and you're 2 months old at the time. And it says, quote, "During this period, Keki Nalavala felt deep love for Baba, but his wife Frani had no special feeling for him. She had not yet had Baba's darshan, nor was she particularly eager for it. Despite this, Keki invited Baba to his home in Dehradun for dinner. Baba picked up their infant son, Naosherwan, who was just 2 months old, taking him on his lap, caressing and kissing him. Frani observed Baba with her son, and at once faith was lit in her heart and has burned brighter ever since. Thereafter, the whole family became dedicated to Baba and worked in his cause." Can you tell us something about the family background and how they found out about this strange man, Meher Baba, and how he came to be invited to your house?
Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
My mother grew up in Karachi, which is today in Pakistan, and my father was born and grew up in a small town in Gujarat called Navsari. Navsari has traditionally been known as a Zoroastrian stronghold. It has several fire temples, a very large concentration of Zoroastrians, Parsis. And Karachi too has had not a very large number, but a smaller number of Zoroastrians, but a very strong and cohesive group. So in the 30s, when Meher Baba announced that he was the same ancient one, and a very large number of people, both in the East and West, came to accept him as the Christ, as Zoroaster, as Ram, Krishna, as the same ancient one. The Zoroastrian community was alarmed. Articles appeared criticizing Meher Baba in various different cities of Pakistan, at that time India, Karachi and Quetta and so forth, Lahore, and in several cities in India, primarily Navsari, Surat, Bombay, Bangalore, places where there were people who had started following Meher Baba. In Navsari, there was particularly a small group of people who were very anti-Meher Baba and wanted to see that he came to came to some harm, particularly when he went for darshan programs. And in fact, when Meher Baba did go once to Navsari for a darshan program, they tried to burn down the pandal or the awning under which Meher Baba was giving darshan. Among these young students who were mischief makers at that time was one known as Keki Desai, who later on became a very devout follower of Meher Baba and dedicated himself to serving Meher Baba and doing his work. He then migrated to Delhi, this man, Keki Desai, and became a traveling salesman for a pharmaceutical company, and came in contact with my father during one of his visits to Dehradun, where we lived, where I was born and I grew up in a family. My father was in business in Dehradun, and he mentioned Meher Baba to my father for the very first time on one of his visits as a pharmaceutical salesman. Initially, my father he had heard all these stories about Meher Baba and his claims, so to say. But gradually, he started to listen to Keki Desai narrate stories about Meher Baba. And before long, an occasion came when a message came from Meher Baba's Manli, out of the blue, asking my father if he could make some living arrangements for Meher Baba's visit to Dehradun. Meher Baba, my father had not met him or not seen him. But the precondition was that while he would make all these arrangements for Meher Baba and his small group of disciples to come to Dehradun, he would not be allowed to see him. But they still had a hope that Baba might change his mind and let them see him. So Keki Desai and my father made all the arrangements for Baba's visit to Dehradun. And one day Keki said, let's try our luck and see if we can see Meher Baba. And they went and they asked the Manli, but they were not allowed to see him. And all he saw was under a curtain, he saw Baba's feet and he walked away. So that was his first introduction to Meher Baba's feet. And then it was several years later that Meher Baba came to live in Dehradun for a longer period, and my father was able to meet with him and spend time with him. And that was soon after a meeting that was held in 1946, for which my father had gone to Lahore, and he had then come back, and then Meher Baba came to Lahore to Dehradun 2 months later, and that was when he took me in his arms and spent some time with the family in our home at 36 Lytton Road. And when I first put my collection of poems together, it was very natural that I named the book In Lap of Love. I think I was about 16 or 17 when that book first appeared. So while it was never a situation of seeking him or seeking a spiritual master, the feeling that our family had was that the family was ready and the master arrived to come into our lives, put his finger on our hearts and awaken us to his love, to his compassion, and the gift of his presence.
Now I wonder whether you have any recollection of that occasion. I suppose not. But if we fast forward 3 years and 4 months, and this was during the time that Baba was on the New Life, and so this is quite a privilege for Naosherwan's family because, as we know, during the new life, Baba was not giving darshans. He was walking around in the persona of a seeker of God. And yet, during the new life, he came to Dehradun on one occasion. And what it says in volume 10 of Lord Mehir is that in March 1950, to serve as Dr. Donkin's dispensary, Keki Nalavala, your father, had rented a small house adjoining his own at 36 Lytton Road in Dehradun, and the opening ceremony was held on February 28th at 2:30 in the afternoon, when Baba attended with the men and women companions and close lovers from Mandri Mafi and Dehradun were also present. Baba distributed cakes and pastries and rava to all, while your mother Frani and Sheru Chacha served tea. On that occasion, Baba explained that Dr. Donkin was practicing as a doctor under Plan 1B, but that is not elucidated in the book. But this is interesting. Before returning to Mandri Mafi, Baba, with the women, visited your home for a while. And at the Nalavalas, Baba played with their 4-year-old son, Naosherwan, and 9-year-old daughter, Marok. Frani complained, your mom complained to Baba, that Keki was always worried about something. And Baba advised Keki, if you worry about yourself, God does not worry about you. Why should he? If you stop worrying, God has to begin to worry for you. Remember him wholeheartedly. Leave your troubles to him, and then you will be free to remain cheerful. Any direct recollections of that occasion? You're almost 4 years old.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have very strong recollection of that period. As we get older, our short-term memory goes away, but the long-term memory sometimes stays very strong, and we are able to recollect intimate details. I have stronger memories of when I was 7, when we spent quite a bit of, sorry, not 7, yes, 7 years old, when Baba was there in 1953. But in 1950, one of the memories that we had as a 4-year-old was that Baba would travel from one end of the town to Rishikesh and to various different places of religious significance, Haridwar, Rishikesh, and places around the river Ganges, contacting what are known as God-intoxicated souls. Early in the morning, he would stop by 36 Lytton Road, and we would all be waiting for him to come very, very early in the morning. And then the front door would open of the car, he would swing his feet out, and he would meet each one of us and then go on his way. This happened every single day. Till, of course, he moved opposite our home, which was at 39 Lytton Road. We were at 36, he was at 39 Lytton Road. And while I don't recollect this incident, it was narrated by Mani Irani, Meher Baba's sister, in one of the videos that were released recently of a little story, as it turns out, about me. She opens up the story by saying that when we were staying opposite the Nalavala home, the Nalavala's little son, Naosherwan, walked in across. I was permitted to walk in and out whenever I felt like as a little boy, and came to Mera and Mani. I went up to them and said, why is Meher Baba sleeping on the floor? And Mani said, why don't you go and ask him? So I go in, Baba was lying on the floor, and I spent some time with Baba, came out, and Mani asked me, did Baba give you an answer? He said, and I said, yes. Baba gave me an answer, and I seemed quite satisfied with the answer. What the point that she was trying to make at the start of this video was that it did not really matter whether you were a 4-year-old child or you were an adult. Baba could communicate with you in silence. And that was the message that she was conveying. So that was a little anecdote about. I remember also at that time that my father didn't have an alphabet. Baba did not come with an alphabet board. But this was something not that I remember, but something that my father had told me. And I have that with me even today. The Baba didn't have an alphabet board because he used to communicate on the alphabet board since he had been silent since 1925. And he did not have the alphabet board. So my father quickly wrote one on a sheet of paper and handed it to Baba, and he conveyed what he had to the family over there. And as far as worry is concerned, that was a major problem that my father always had. And in the later years, Baba wrote that if you worry all the time, why should God really worry? Because you're taking over God's responsibility. So he always had something to worry about. And as Baba tells us about worry, that we worry about things that have never even happened.
Yeah.
And that's what dissipates your energy. So that's one of the recollections of that period.
May I ask you just in general, because Lord Meher doesn't specify, how long did your parents live, and where did they live in their older years, etc.?
My parents, my father passed away a few years back. My mother lives in Bangalore now. And they led a very dedicated and devoted life to Meher Baba in all the years that soon after they came to him. Yes.
In Lord Meher, they jump ahead after that incident 15 years. So I'd like you to fill in that blank a little bit with one or two tidbits, the things that you remember the most during those earlier years where you start to have more conscious memories of your dealings with Baba.
Yes. 1953 was a very important year for not only the Nalavala family, but for several families who came in close contact to Meher Baba. That was the year that he spent a year in Dehradun. And I'll move forward to September 7, 1953, which was a very, very significant year when Meher Baba gave the discourse on the highest of the high. It was also Zoroaster's birthday. And my recollection was of the time before we went for a darshan program at a house called 101 Rajpur Road. Meher Baba had announced that he would meet people in Dehradun and of other towns and states in that region. And several thousand people came to see him. And my recollection is what happened before the darshan program and before he made this announcement. The Women Mandali had invited us to celebrate Zoroaster's birthday, which they celebrated every year. And I recollect that my father was not permitted, but my mother and my sister and I were permitted to be in Baba's presence. The men were not allowed among the Women Mandali, and in this case, the Women Mandali were there, primarily Mehra and Mani. And according to Indian custom, they put a little vermilion on the floor, and Baba stepped on it, and Mehra put a not vermilion, but chalk on the ground, and Mehra put a vermilion on Baba's forehead and said happy birthday to him. And I interjected and said, why is my birthday not being celebrated? So Mehra said, of course we will celebrate your birthday as well. So when Baba stepped away, I stepped onto the chalk, and Mehra put a little vermilion on my forehead. And then we all went to the dining table, and Baba gave each one of us a morsel of rava, which is a sign of a celebration. So it was a very happy time My sister at that time used to learn Indian classical music. I used to play the tabla. So we kind of regaled the little Mandli there and regaled Baba with playing of the tabla, and she sang a little song. And then Baba had just come back to from the United States, and he had a few gifts for us, and then he gave me a kaleidoscope, and my sister got a little doll, both from the United States. So it was a very happy time for us. Then we all moved on to where Baba was giving darshan, and there were lines for darshan, for taking prasad, and for taking and for getting an embrace from him, and we would get into line again and again in order to get prasad. So it was these little childish pranks, and then we moved on. Darshan essentially means being in the presence of the Lord. Being in the presence of the Master is called darshan. And prasad is a little gift of love that the Master gives to each one. So this was and then of course, while I was not old enough to fathom the import of his message of the highest of the high, which he gave on that particular day, when he declared that he was not this, that, but that he was the highest of the high, and that in essence, short of saying that he was the avatar. So a lot of people were moved by the message that he gave at that time.
Wonderful. Well, we come to a very, very critical point in your life, according to what Bauji wrote in Lord Meher, and I'm talking about May 1965, and you're 18 years old, going on 19 years, and something like 13 or 14 years have passed since that last occasion that you just described. And it's described as follows. After the Darshan program in May 1965, Keki Nalavala, your father, and his son Naosherwan were allowed to remain in Pune for 3 additional days because Naosherwan had some difficulty breathing, and Baba wanted him to be treated by Dr. Grant. This was arranged, and Baba even paid some amount toward Naosherwan's treatment. And it's mentioned later in the book that on that occasion, or in that month of May, a very, very deep spiritual conviction came over you that started working and manifesting even in your behavior. Can you tell us how that started and what happened?
Meher Baba has said that the relationship between a seeker eventually turns into a relationship of love between a lover and a beloved, and a follower and a master turns into discipleship. This relationship is often a very silent one, pretty much unknown to the seeker. But the culmination of this relationship happens when individual ego gets erased and one begins to become conscious of the Master's divinity. Baba said that there were 3 stages. One is the stage where one suffers from what he called divine desperateness or divine discontent. When the seeker becomes conscious of something more that the seeker is seeking, and the Master pulls the seeker towards from unconscious divinity to conscious divinity. This Baba called as the stone stage. As the seeker steps onto the pathway where he or she is really intensely in severe agony of separation from the real self, and goes hither and thither, tries out various different drugs or visits to different spiritual masters, and is unable to really come to a master who can satisfy the individual spiritually, Baba terms as the worm stage. And the third stage that Baba talks about is when the disciple is ready, the master appears. We often hear the expression coming to Meher Baba, but it is never so. It is never coming to Meher Baba. It's always Meher Baba coming into the life of the individual, putting his finger on your heart and awakening you to your consciousness. In other words, transforming your consciousness. What is transformation of consciousness? The concept of transformation of consciousness is awakening to God's love, awakening to Meher Baba's love, finding ourselves in His presence, feeling His presence in our lives, and accepting to follow the spiritual journey that He's etched out for you. Even though I was born in a family of Baba lovers, I suffered from severe, tremendous separation from him. After 1953, I had not met Meher Baba. And as the years grew by, I became more and more desperate in his love. I could not contain myself. At times I said to myself that I will not let him separate myself from him. I will find him within me. Something that I have been struggling to do more and more and more and more since he dropped his body in 1969. Trying to find him within the heart, trying to keep him within. Trying to sustain the link that and the bond that he created. But a stage came in my life where I said to myself that enough is enough. I can't take it anymore. I have to give up everything. I have to give up the life that I was leading, give up my parents, renounce everything, in other words. And this divine desperateness, this divine discontent turned into beating the head against the wall, getting unconscious, seeing all kinds of visions and reading extracts from spiritual books and repeating them. Strange experiences started appearing. I started experiencing, much to my family's concern. My mother and father were very concerned of this. I would feel very, very cold when it was over 100 degrees temperature, and so forth. Unable to understand, and Baba had given instructions, he was in seclusion, that nobody could write letters to him. But when this went on and on for several months, and I could not contain myself, I secretly decided that I would leave my parents, leave my studies, and go to Baba. And this was once when I decided that I would even disobey him. So I sent a letter to Meher Baba saying that I was coming on such and such a date. So the date came nearer. I bought my ticket, and I had not mentioned it to anybody. But 2 days before I was to leave for Ahmednagar, I couldn't resist telling my mother, because I felt that she would be brokenhearted, she would be in anguish. And so I mentioned it to her. While she was not concerned about the fact that I was leaving home and going to Meher Baba and being a part of his mandli, or his group of disciples, she repeatedly kept asking me, what would you do if Meher Baba turned you away and said you could not stay at Meherazad? And I kept on responding to her by saying that, oh, I'll live in a hut somewhere in the fields around Meherazad. I was just about 18 years old at that time. I was a teenager. But my mother was very concerned that in that state of mind, I would be attracted to some Swami or yogi or some spiritual master who would lead me astray. That was her major concern. So she sent a long cable to Meher Baba, explaining the situation to him, unknown to me. And a day before I was to leave home, it was the next day at night, I get a cable comes to our door. And you know, in India, for some odd reason, the cables always come in the middle of the night. And it's usually the head of the family, my father, opened the door, and there was the cable man, the telegram man. And he opens the cable and he doesn't understand what it means, because my father did not know this. I had taken a promise from my mother not to mention it to my father. He was the Titan, and he was a very strict man, and I was always afraid of what his responses would be at every stage of my life. So when he saw the cable, he couldn't understand it and gave it to my mother. And of course my mother knew. And what the cable said was very simply, renounce nothing but your present attitude. Meher Baba. Renounce nothing but your present attitude. Meher Baba. And letter follows. So my mother said, wait till the letter comes. The letter came 2 days later, and the cable was repeated in the letter. And Baba instructed me that I must obey my parents. I must continue with my studies, appear for my graduation, irrespective of the results. And that it was important for me to obey him at that time. So it was instructions from the master, and I decided that I would not make the next move of leaving. But then I wrote back to him saying that, well, if I couldn't come to him, I would like to keep a fast, keep silence, meditate. And in order for me to tell you his exact words, I had printed this once. He wrote back to me saying, for spiritual aspirants, renunciation is of help, but those who love the avatar and are under his direct guidance do not have to renounce anything. The lovers of the avatar have simply to obey the avatar's instructions and to love him wholeheartedly. Knowing that I was in a very fragile state of mind, and that I could be a prey of any of the many mushrooming spiritual masters at that time, he wrote again, don't be led astray by any Tom, Dick, Harry of a spiritual master. Beware of such cheap experiences and spiritual stunts of spiritual clowns. In response to my letter about silence and meditation, Baba wrote to me, "Do not observe prolonged silence nor meditate. Do not serve yourself by doing so. You who lead a dedicated life in my cause have no need for such discipline. You are close to me and you are very dear to me. I know how you strive to be merged in my love. I want you not to strive for this, but to allow your dear love to flow freely to me in its natural course. Know one most important thing in the spiritual line, and that is that no amount of your striving to reach me could transport you to me. Simplest thing for you to do is to just love me in the most natural way, as a child would love his mother, and carry out anything I on my own command you to do." And then he gave me the most difficult message and instruction: keep cheerful and happy in my love. So these were the kind of instructions that we got from Meher Baba at every stage in our lives. We were very dependent on him for the smallest decisions. If he hadn't heard from us for some time, if my mother had not written to him, he would send a cable saying, "How are you keeping? Why have you forgotten your beloved?" So we had a constant communication with the Master. It was a strong bond of the lover and the beloved. And that's when I came to write his book, his biography. I named it The Beloved, because he was and is the beloved.
Wonderful.
So then things were still not very normal, and I was very, very deep in love with him, writing poems to him. Each birthday I would send him a poem just so that I could get a cable from him, because he had put restrictions on writing letters, and you could write a poem to him on his birthday as a gift. Then one day, I'm continuing with this in my meeting with him, and today actually, rather, the 4th of May is 38 years of my meeting him in 1966, so it's an anniversary in a sense. So one day I read a small little news item in the Hindustan Times that in Delhi there were plans to convene the Third World Religions Conference. And this was that very next year after this happened. And I was very attracted to participating in it. I would also be considered the youngest delegate. I was just 19 at that time. And there were a very large number of people. Attendees were coming from all over the world. I had never given a talk to such a large number of people. So I was apprehensive, but 100 rupees was the fee to participate in this conference. And I wrote to the organizers. And one of the things that I had to do was to send a subject. So I thought up a subject that they might imagine it was being sent by an adult. So I sent a subject called "The Supervening Powers of Faith in the Evolution of World Peace," which didn't really mean much, but I sent it on to the organizers because I wanted them to feel that I was an adult. So I sent it off, and sure enough, I got a response saying that I would be allowed to speak in the panel on world peace. So I didn't really realize the ramifications of what I was getting into. I was in Dehradun, and this was in Delhi, and it was at the Ramlila grounds. And the Ramlila grounds is like Madison Square Garden. It's huge. It's mammoth. That's where the
Near Radford.
Yes, and that's where the Prime Minister gives his Independence Day speech, and thousands upon thousands of people gather. So I land up in Delhi, and I stay at a Baba lover's house who happened to be the social secretary of the President of India. So he had a house in the Rashtrapati Bhavan enclave, which is sprawling viceregal. It used to be the Viceroy's house, and then it was the President of India's house. So he had a very nice house, and I went to stay there, and not realizing there were 5 other Baba lovers who had also thought of the same thing and were also participants. But none of them were on the World Peace panel. They were in different other panels. So they were also there, and I had already written to Baba that I was participating in this conference. So before that, before the conference, they had a press conference. Now this conference was organized by a Jain Muni called Muni Sushil Kumar. And the organizing secretary, his name was Baron Frary von Blomberg, who was a follower of another spiritual master who was also a convener of the organization called Sant Kirpal Singh. Some of you may have heard that name. He was a spiritual master who had come in contact with Meher Baba. So he was an active convener of this conference. So there was a press conference, and at this press conference all the delegates introduced themselves, and they were completely taken aback when I walked in and introduced myself as one of the speakers on the World Peace panel, because I was just a small boy and a lot of older venerable people were there. So but when I introduced myself to the Baron, he immediately took me under his wing, and he encouraged me, talked with me, took some time off, and it was a happy situation. But what had happened was that what we did not know was that we would face some antagonism here as well. So the day arrived, and of course we had some funny incidents also, whereby Sudhir of course knows that Muni Sushil Kumar, who was the president of the conference, was a Jain Muni. Now among the Jains there are 2 sects, the Swetambar and the Digambar. Now the Swetambars are the ones who wear clothes, but they cover their mouth with a piece of cloth, because according to the Jain religion, insects must not go into the mouth. They believe in complete non-violence. So they do not eat a lot of vegetables because for fear that there might be inadvertently some worms in them. So they are very strict about these things. And then the Digambar sect, that's the other sect, they do not wear any clothes. They go around naked. Now the women among them are clean shaven, and they drape their bodies with one sari, just one whole sari. Basically a piece of white cloth covers their body, and they never take any other transport, but they walk from one place to another. And these nuns go from one Jain temple to another Jain temple all their lives as a measure of penance and meditation and so forth. They are called sadhvis. So one day earlier, all the delegates were invited to a procession. So here we were with a whole lot of naked men walking the streets of Delhi. So, well, they were also on the stage. Now, of course, at this conference, there were people from all over the world, with people with conical hats and with robes and with stars and with stripes, and anybody who was nobody was there, and they were all philosophers and preachers and spiritual masters and yogis and swamis, and all kinds of people had come for this. This was similar to what Vivekananda had addressed in Chicago. It was that kind of a religions conference. And of course, on the very first day, the inaugural day, the Prime Minister came, and all religions were represented by their head priests. So the Zoroastrian head priest had come, he gave a prayer, and the Christian from the Vatican had come, and so forth. And one of the Meher Baba followers, who was also a member of parliament, had asked that he could also recite the Master's Prayer, and that also from the Ram Leela grounds.
Wow.
Now the Ram Leela grounds is where you have you climb around 20 or 30 steps, and it's a raised platform with a little canopy. It's a permanent platform, and then as far as the eye can see, you have thousands upon thousands of people. So this was a morning session of this, and while it was not the same as the previous evening, but there were several thousand people there at the panel where I was to give a speech. And I had never given a talk to 10 people. And here I was in the middle of speaking to thousands. And I had prepared my speech. It was a 45-minute speech, and that was the time allotted, and it was on world peace. And I had prepared myself with messages from various different avatars: Zoroaster, Ram, Krishna, Muhammad, Jesus. And then I declared that I have come to give the message of Meher Baba, who's the apostle of peace and unity and oneness. And as I uttered those words, from nowhere, 2 men came and pounced on me, just pulling at my trouser, asking me to sit down. The moment this happened, this was totally unexpected. And the moment this happened, I completely forgot. My mind went blank. Didn't know what to say, what to do. But at one point I forgot to tell you is that when I came to give the speech that morning, a cable had arrived early in the morning where I was staying from Meher Baba. It was addressed in my name, and it said, "I'm with you at the Third World Religions Conference, Meher Baba." So I had complete confidence that he would take care of, that he would not make me feel nervous, that he would take care of me in every conceivable way. But this I did not expect, that I would be physically assaulted. So as I was looking at these men and trying to speak, suddenly Sant Kirpal Singh turns round and tells these 2 men, "Let the young man speak." And they just slithered away. And I suddenly muster up courage, and I speak to this large audience and say that I'm being asked to leave the stage. If you say I'll leave the stage because I'm representing Meher Baba, and from the audience there was a roar that said, "We want Meher Baba, we want Meher Baba."
Wow.
And I went on to speak about Meher Baba, about his life and about his message briefly, which had nothing to do with the subject that I had prepared.
Wonderful.
And then I walked up the stage, and then Sant Kirpal Singh called me and said that, "Young man, I have a lot of work for you in the future." And I said that any work in the domain of Meher Baba, I'll be happy to do. So then I moved away, and that was the end of this a little unhappy, but a happy episode.
Very interesting.
And then that evening, I won't go into that story because that's another little episode, was when I was asked by an aunt of mine whose husband happened to be the president of the Zoroastrian Association in Delhi to come and give my impressions about the conference. But the main speaker, I was not the main speaker. The main speaker was the head priest of the Zoroastrians who had come. And in giving my impressions, I talked about Meher Baba, and when I mentioned Meher Baba's name, the priest jumped from his seat and walked out in a huff, very upset that he had been insulted. And of course, a lot of Meher Baba followers came and asked, a lot of Zoroastrians came and asked me about Meher Baba. So that was a little incident. A lot of you are probably wondering as to why was why did all this happen? Why was it that some people were opposed to Meher Baba and others came to accept him? But in India, religious traditions are so strong, sometimes so rigid, sometimes so unbending, that even when the true master, when the avatar takes birth amidst mankind, in your heart of hearts you might recognize the avatar, but you're afraid of the several different traditions that you have been bound with, the rites, the rituals, the ceremonies, the isms that you have been born in. I don't dispute that several hundred years from now there would be something called Merism, that we would be known as Merists or something to that effect, and that we would become also very rigid. But Meher Baba's message was, I have come not to teach but to awaken. And when we talk of awakening, we talk of a transformation of consciousness. In thinking about these factors that influence our lives, there's one common thread that follows us all our lives, and that what happens when we are awakened to that love? What happens when we come in contact with a divine human being who claims that he's God in human form? Where do we go from there? And that is the question that a lot of us sitting here are asking. The very fact that all of you are here is not a coincidence. It is not a random situation that you are here today listening and hearing the name Meher Baba. You are destined to hear his name. From this point onwards, where it takes you is what you are comprised of, your mental impressions, your sanskars, and your destiny. That's where it'll take you. As I was earlier mentioning to you, we reach a point in our lives where you have this feeling of discontent. You want this more. There is a pull. And very often, this pull brings us at the feet of the Master. But what stops us from accepting that is our intellect. All my life, I had a problem with my intellect. The intellect was like a millstone round my neck. It was a blockage on the opening of my heart to Meher Baba's love. Because being a journalist and a writer and then an editor of a magazine, I was always asking questions all the time. Of course, that trend continues till this day, but Meher Baba did help me awaken that, and I'll come to that. But the intellect is something that Meher Baba asked us to put aside and to open our hearts to his love. So from divine desperateness, we come to the intellect. Once we are able to put this heavy millstone of the intellect aside and open our hearts to Meher Baba's love, to God's love, we are ready. And when we say we are ready to take refuge in him. Because we've already been through a series of several lifetimes of mental impressions, we've tried religion, we've been through that, and then with the what the Baba used the word sublimation of our mental impressions, we reach a point in our lives that we are ready to surrender. What does surrender mean? Among the Buddhists, they call abhishek. Surrender, when they come to the master, they lie prostrate and they say that I have surrendered. But just by saying that I have surrendered doesn't mean that you have surrendered. When you say you've surrendered, it means that I have become, this vessel is an empty vessel. Fill it with your love. Fill it with your grace. And the key operating word is grace. Nothing happens without His grace. You do not take a single step on the spiritual path without His grace. So you come to the point where it's surrender. And that, just by saying you surrender, doesn't happen. It takes several lifetimes. But you've taken the highest intuitive step, your highest intuitive option, that you're taking the step towards surrender. But with surrenderance comes responsibility. And that responsibility is selflessness. Letting go of self-interest. Recognition that Meher Baba is the only one who can help you counterbalance illusion from reality. Because your pathway is from unconscious divinity to conscious divinity, from illusion to reality. So you come to the next point of selflessness, of letting go of self-interest, thinking of others, serving others. The next point. Now, I've talked of divine desperateness. Think about it. It's D for divine desperateness or divine discontent. I is for the intellect. S is for surrender. The second S is for selflessness, service to others. Because as you serve others, as you help others selflessly, you take one more additional step towards service to God. The next is L for love. And that is the magic word that motivates us and brings us oneness. Someone mentioned this evening, inclusiveness, unity. As Meher Baba said, you and I are not we, but one. So love is the motivating factor. Love is the glue that brings us together. Love is what helps us to sublimate our neurotic tendencies and make us come into oneness with each other. And very often as we go on this path that Meher Baba has divined for us, has devised for us, we tend to stumble, we tend to lose our way in the attractions of the world, in the attraction of the marketplace. And there's one single factor that brings us back onto the path, and that is remembrance of Him, thinking of Him, repeating His name, visualizing. That's the word that I use, V, visualizing. So you think about Him, you repeat His name, you remember Him, and what happens? The tremendous ego that you've built up over several lifetimes that makes you think that you're infallible, that puts you in a position where you start wondering, is this my existence? Is this what I'm here on earth for? What am I doing here? This massive ego is just driving me insane. And that's the E for ego. And what do we end up with? Dissolve. That is what I've learned from Meher Baba. That as we go from this divine discontent, this divine desperateness, to the elimination of the ego. But Baba tells us that your ego does not need to be eliminated completely, because you need what is known as a provisional ego. I have accomplished this. I produce a magazine. I wouldn't be able to produce it if I did not have a provisional ego working towards it. But what negates that provisional ego is the attachment to the result. Because we are devastated. If an issue looks poor, if it's not acceptable, we are devastated. But then it also gives us the impetus and the motivation to improve ourselves. So it's a matter of will. When we reach that point of dissolution, we say, I am willing to accept Meher Baba's will. As Baba says, everything that happens to you is my will. How you take it is your will. That's very, very important.
Repeat again, please.
Everything that happens to you is my will. My meaning Meher Baba's will.
Yeah.
But how you take it, how you translate that will to your life,
It's my will.
is your will. You know, it's when we don't think about Meher Baba, when we feel, sometimes there are barren phases when you don't feel about him, when you don't think about him. That's the time when we are most vulnerable. And that's the time when we nearly need to reach out to him. And we come to a point in our lives, where do I go from here? We call ourselves Baba lovers, we call ourselves Meherists, whatever we can call ourselves. And we reach a point, I have discovered Meher Baba. We stand on the rooftops and we say, I have discovered God in human form, I have discovered the avatar. And then life takes over and we become tepid Baba lovers. We become tepid in our relationship with him. That relationship that we've come to accept, that bond that we've come to accept, we sometimes let loose. And that's when we suffer. And when we suffer, we say, why me? When something good happens to us, do we ever question, why me? But when something bad happens to us, why me? Baba says that each time you suffer or you have an experience of agony or suffering, it is an opportunity. It is an opportunity for take you to a higher spiritual level. See, when we suffer, the avatar suffers. He agonizes because
Every suffering, I mean physical suffering, suffering that you have no money or this or that, he meant this suffering as
every aspect of suffering. The only advantage when you hold on to the hem of Meher Baba's garment is that he helps you sustain yourself. He takes you to the edge and pulls you back. He never lets you fall over the precipice. That is my conviction. That is the conviction that he has given me. and that is the conviction that I'm sharing with you today, is that everybody in the world, there isn't a human being who does not suffer, who does not agonize over situations that happen in each one's life, or agonizes and suffers over one's weaknesses. We all have weaknesses. Just because we've come to Baba, or even if we've met Meher Baba like I have, it doesn't mean that the weaknesses have been dissolved and that I have been completely purified. But Baba says that take a dip into this vast ocean of my love, and I will turn dross into gold. That is what his message is. So, moving along with the story, I go home after this conference, and there is a cable from Meher Baba inviting me to come to Pune, where he was giving darshan. I was unable to go for the darshan program because I had to appear for an exam. But 4 days later, I was invited to be in his presence. So you'll have to keep a count of the time so
Absolutely. You have 50 minutes.
Okay.
5-0.
Okay. So this was a momentous day in my life. It was May 4th, 1966. Meher Baba had completed a major darshan program where several thousand people had come for his darshan. I was invited 3 days after this darshan program. And I would like to give a sense, a feel of being in his presence. I was seeing him after a very, very long time. I had not seen him since 1953. And I go in. There's a side door to, this was a place that had been given by Maharani Shanta Devi of Baroda, a palace that had been given to Meher Baba for his darshan programs. He used to lead a very simple life, dress in a very simple way. His close disciples led a very simple life in Meherazad, in Mehrabad, in a small place near Ahmednagar. They lived a life of complete poverty. But Maharani Shanta Devi of Baroda recognized Meher Baba's divinity, came to accept him as the avatar, and had requested him to let him use her palace in Pune to give a darshan program, because it was a large palace and several thousand people would come for Meher Baba's darshan. So this was a small room adjoining the side of the palace. There's a very large veranda with a lot of statues all alongside, and this was a small little room where the mandali met. So I enter the room, and incidentally, when Meher Baba had invited me to be in his presence, it was, of course, he wanted to hear firsthand about my being at the Third World Religions Conference. And there was a caveat that I should not ask any questions, because he knew that this enemy called the mind was always overactive. So I enter the room, the mandali room. I take my shoes out. I go into the mandali room, and I see Meher Baba sitting in the middle. It must have been over 100 degrees temperature. It was very, very hot. Meher Baba was bare from the waist up, and he was wearing a 3/4 length pajama, something like a culotte. And Erach, his interpreter and disciple, sat next to him, and alongside the wall were sitting members of his mandali. As some of you know, one of his close Mundley was the Australian poet Francis Brabazon, who lived with him and spent time with his close disciples. Over there, he was also seated. So, as I went in, there was Meher Baba seated. And I was wafted by a very strong fragrance, which accompanied Meher Baba wherever he went. It was not perfume, it was not the smell of flowers, it was a fragrance that impacted you, that hit you. It was a combination of rose and jasmine, and you didn't see any flowers around the room, but it was a strong perfume that pervaded the room. So I went in, I came towards him, and I rushed into his arms. I embraced him, I kissed him on both his cheeks, he kissed me on both my cheeks, and he pressed me hard, and I got the feeling of kissing a woman on the cheeks and being embraced by the strength of a man. He looked radiant. He looked beautiful. There was a certain sweetness about him. And then I sat. He asked me to sit at his feet. Then Irach, his secretary, said, Baba would like to know about your visit to Delhi for the religions conference. And for those of some of you who may not know, Meher Baba was silent for 44 years. He communicated through the means of signs and gestures. In the early years, he communicated through writing on a slate. In later years, with an alphabet board that he communicated on, and then through his own means of signs and gestures. So till he dropped his body on January 31st, 1969, he kept silence, but continued to communicate to the world and to the thousands and thousands of people who came to see him. He dictated books, he dictated discourses, his messages, all through the medium of silence. So, as Irach mentions this, for some odd, strange, goofy reason, I start doing this with my fingers. I have no idea why I did that. So Irach tells me, Baba is silent, you are not. And I immediately realized that I was being really silly by trying to do something with my fingers. And then I started speaking in Gujarati. And Baba again said something, and she says, Francis can't understand Gujarati, speak in English. So then I started narrating the story in English. One of Meher Baba's methods, as you narrated something, would be that he would interrupt. Always he would interrupt. It was never, and then you had to come back to where you'd left off. So I was narrating the story, particularly about the Third World Religions Conference, and then what happened in the evening with the Zoroastrian priest, and Baba thought it was very hilarious. He thought it was very funny, and he would laugh, and it was my show, and I was making the most of it. So suddenly he would stop me and say, he would turn to somebody and say, do you love me? And the person would respond, he says, yes, Baba. Then as I would continue talking, and then again he would turn to somebody and say, do you love me? And he would say, absolutely, Baba. Something to that effect. So at one stage he asked me, do you love me? I said, yes, Baba. And that was normal, and I took it. Then as I continued narrating the story, he turns to somebody else and says, "Do you accept me as God?" And the man says, "Darim Cheshak," which is in Persian, which means without a doubt. And I continue talking. And then I'm coming closer to the end of my story when suddenly Meher Baba turns to me and says, "Do you accept me as God in human form?" And I said, "Absolutely, Baba." And he reaches out his hand, and I reach out my hand, and we clasp each other's hand, and he says, "I want you to tell the world that I'm God in human form." And I just say, "Yes, Baba." I was so stunned with what he had asked of me. But Baba never allowed a single moment of sobriety around him. He wanted all the moments to be very light-hearted. So having said this, he claps. And one of his women mandli, her name was Dr. Goher Irani, comes out holding something in her hand and hands it over to Baba. And Baba takes it and then beckons me further and hands it over to me. And that was this medallion. It's an image of Meher Baba on one side and mastery and servitude symbol on the other side. And this medallion he handed me as if to put a stamp on the mandate that he was giving me. And over the years I've often thought of this mandate, and I have never flinched in carrying it out in the best way I can through the magazine that he asked me to produce called The Glow International, or the books that I've done over the years, or my sharing. But I've always felt that this mandate was not alone for me. All of us, all of you, those who've been touched by Meher Baba's love, have this mandate of sharing his message of love, truth, unity, and oneness amongst those who come in contact with. A very large number of you have never seen him in physical form. But that should never matter, because he has chosen you to be a part of his ministry. And that becomes your responsibility. It becomes your right. It becomes your duty to share his message. Not proselytize, not convert, but to be able to share his message of love with those who are seeking that. His job is to make us conscious of our divinity. Your job is to share his name, his message with others. So he gave me this, and then I sat back, and he asked me about my health. And no, I'll come to that later. Before that, he asked me if I knew any jokes, because there was this air of sobriety, there was this heaviness in the air. And he asked me if I knew any jokes, and I said, "No, Baba. I have a lousy sense of humor," and I said I couldn't think of anything. But I was carrying my harmonica in my pocket, and I used to play the harmonica in a small band that I had. We used to play in public, and we had a drummer and a bongo player, and we used to play the harmonica. So I said, but I'm carrying my harmonica. So Baba then called his women mandali to come and stand behind the door so they could hear me play. So I just played, in those days we had our favorite songs like Come September and Havana Gila and all those kind of songs we used to play. And I just played on and on and on. He never asked me to stop till I went out of breath and stopped playing. So this was a kind of a one-man presentation in his presence. Then Baba asked me if I wanted to say anything more. And once again, the enemy number one, the mind, came into play. And I said, here is a chance to possibly trick him into answering a question. So I said, Baba, at the Third World Religions Conference, a lot of people asked me a lot of questions, and by your grace I was able to answer all of them. There was one question that I couldn't answer. So Baba got concerned. What question? He thought I was going to ask him, a tough one. And I said, Baba, several people came up to me and said, how can Meher Baba say that he's God in human form? And Baba took a sigh of relief as to what a simple question this is. So, but then he again became serious. And he said, you, Naosherwan, are God in human form. Irach here is God in human form. Francis is God in human form. All of you are God in human form. I am God in human form. But each one of you are unconscious of your divinity. I am conscious of my divinity. It is my job to make each one of you, not only you, but humanity, conscious of my divinity. It is my job to give you the conviction that you too are God in human form. And then he asked me to read his book, God Speaks, in which he explains conviction in great detail. So, in thinking of this, having heard the avatar himself say this, and when I often talk to total strangers and I tell them, I would say to them, and I would say, you are God. He says, me? God? I'm terrible. I'm a sinner. I have so many weaknesses. I couldn't possibly be God. That would be a natural response. And I would turn around and say that what are the attributes of God? Love, mercy, compassion, charity, forgiveness. Don't you have all these qualities? Don't you love? Don't you forgive? Don't you have the capacity to forgive? Are you not charitable? Are you not truthful? These are attributes of God. So what denies you from claiming that you too are God? Well, they start thinking about it. And why are we able to say these things? Is because he gives us the conviction. If someone were to ask me, what is the greatest gift that Meher Baba has given you? I would say it is conviction of his divinity. Conviction that he is God in human form. That acceptance. See, if I accept him as God in human form, he's not going to get a raise in pay. He is here for us. And he suffers because of us. So, this is the explanation he gave me. And then Irach puts his hand in his pocket, and as I mentioned to you earlier, every year I used to send him a poem. I did not know that he was going to invite me on that occasion. So Iraj said, look, because of the darshan program, we haven't had a chance to read this out to Baba. Why don't you read this poem that you've sent him on his birthday? So since February, the poem had been unread, but Iraj was carrying it in his pocket. So this poem that I had written was called Insani Kamil, which means the perfect man. And what I had done is, on this particular occasion, I had abstracted all the Urdu words that were used in God Speaks by Baba and put it together as a poem. And I had composed a poem and sent it to him. So I read this poem. In the early years, I used to send him a poem, several poems, and one poem that I sent called The Tavern, Meher Baba said that he had it read 3 times so that he could remember it when he in his next advent 700 years later. So this poem I read, and in that, at the end of it, there was a word Vasla. And he picked up on that word and he said, do you know the meaning of Vasla? I said, yes, Baba, Vasla means union. And he says, what a union. He threw up his hands like this and said, what a union between the lover and the beloved. Vasla is the most important word in the spiritual language. Union of the lover with the beloved. So that was another little nugget on this occasion. Coming to the point that was mentioned in this book about my breathing. Well, it was not exactly my breathing, but it had to do with a rather unsavory aspect of my health, and that was severe constipation, not realizing that it could have graduated into asthma, which it ultimately had. But I had a severe problem of constipation, and he would ask you sometimes the most awkward questions, and so I had to tell him that this is what I had a problem with. So he said, have you ever had a physical done? And I said, no, Baba. In India, people just don't go to a doctor and get physical done because they're very expensive. They charge a large sum of money. And in those days, it was very expensive. My father was a man of modest means. He couldn't afford to send us for physicals. So Baba called Dr. Irani and said that she should arrange for a physical the very next morning. And she came back and said, yes, Baba, I've called Dr. Grant at a clinic next door called the Ruby Medical Clinic, and Naosherwan will be examined by Dr. Grant, who was also Baba's doctor, the next morning. So that was fine. It was arranged, and time came for me to leave. So I go and I bow down, touch Baba's feet, embrace him, kiss him. And as I'm leaving, again Dr. Gohar comes, hands over an envelope to Baba. And Baba gives me this envelope. And I have no idea what's in it. So I walk back. You don't turn your back towards the master, you back out. So I back out. And as I leave the door and I'm about to wear my shoes, I open the envelope and I find 600 100-rupee notes in that envelope. And that was the amount that had to be paid to the doctor for my physical. So I immediately rushed back to Baba to return that envelope. And Iraj says, this is Baba's prasad, and you don't return prasad to Baba. So prasad is the gift of love that the master gives you. So that was the reference to.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So then what happens is that this is the first half of the morning, and then a new set of people. My show time was over. And then there was a new set of people. In this case, there was a whole group of Iranis who had come from Iran for Baba's darshan. And I went and sat at the back of the room. But then in the afternoon, there was all those people who had worked during the darshan program and had not had an opportunity of Baba's darshan, these are the volunteers, were given a chance to be in his presence in another larger room on the side. My father was one of the volunteers, so he was a part of this large group, but I was not. So I was the only one sitting on the veranda while everybody was else in this very large hall. So Baba sends Iraj out and says, is there anybody sitting out? And Iraj says, yes, Baba, Naosherwan is sitting out. So Iraj then calls me in, and I look and I see this wave, this huge, large number of people. They'd occupied every seat conceivable. Baba sitting on the chair, and he was at that time wearing a long sadra and pajamas, and he was not bare-bodied. And the only spot I see is at his feet. So I wend my way and I go and sit at his feet, but I couldn't sit facing him the way I was sitting facing him in the Mandli room. So my back is turned towards him because that's the only way I could kind of sit, because Iraj had needed that space for himself. So it was a little kind of an awkward situation because my back was towards him. But Baba's feet were constantly touching my back, so that was all right. So, but then I moved sideways and so forth, and part of me saw him up and I could see him. And then the various different people were introduced, and Baba said, how's your family and your children and your mother or your father or your wife or your husband? And there were introductions, and he gave instructions to some, and then the meeting came to an end. And then it was time for Aarti. Aarti is a prayer in praise of God. And this was an Aarti, a song that I knew very well, which I always sang. It was not the Gujarati Aarti, it was a Hindi Aarti. So as the Aarti started, and I uttered a few syllables of the song, when I was overwhelmed with very strong, powerful wave, overwhelming feelings of love. I felt as if my entire being was up to the brim with a feeling of tremendous, tremendous love, and I started sobbing uncontrollably. And as the tears fell on my hands, they were not warm or hot tears, but they were icy cold tears. And Iraj, I could see amongst the tears coming down, I could see Iraj coming towards me and saying something which I couldn't hear, and I could see Baba telling Iraj to leave me alone. And at that moment, it seemed as if my heart would burst. And then at one point, Baba just put his hand on my head, and it was as if the tap had been turned off. The faucet had been turned off. But that was a moment, as T.S. Eliot called it, the timeless moment that I experienced. Him lifting the heavy burden of the intellect to the opening of my heart to his love and his constant presence in my life. That was a momentous day in his presence. And
in that very same period of time, and you had been writing, perhaps as a hobby, perhaps with the ambition of being a professional writer, but you then undertook the work of writing a magazine which at first was called The Spark.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you were informed by the authorities that the name was already taken, a list
Yes.
was sent to Baba to choose another
Right.
name,
Right.
and Baba decided that it should be called The Glow. And now for the last almost 40 years, you've been involved in that work, and we enjoy The Glow very, very much. It has very, very high standard graphically, and in terms of, I know I'm polishing my own apple because I've written for The Glow. But could you tell us a little bit about how Baba directed you into that
Yes.
work, please?
Well, it was 40 days before he dropped his body that was the last time that I met him. Again, it was a wedding celebration of two Baba lovers who were getting married, and I could not attend the wedding. But the day that day was the day when I was interviewed. I couldn't attend the wedding because I was interviewed for a job of a reporter at the Times of India, which was actually my first job. And I had not known the results of that job, but I had simultaneously been interviewed for the Air Force and the Army, and I had been selected for both the Air Force and the Army, and I did not know about the Times of India, but the indication was that I would get selected for the job because this was my second interview. There were two interviews for the same job, the one in Delhi, one in Bombay. So I took that opportunity of coming to Baba, and it was one afternoon, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that I arrived from Bombay by train
This
to
is
Pune.
Christmas Eve, 1968, correct? December
Yes,
68.
yes. And I walk into Baba's presence, and by this time we had heard a lot about Meher Baba's suffering. He had been getting severe spasms to a point where his entire body would be lifted off his bed. He was in deep seclusion. At the same time, the doctors were completely unable to diagnose what was wrong with him. It was said that it was some strange ailment that had affected his body. He had suffered from urea, but his body did not smell at all the same fragrance you experienced. So I walk into his presence. He's lying on a bed, and his secretary Erich asks me to sit at the edge of his bed. And then three other people walk in. Three of the Mandli, they walk in with chairs because there were not enough chairs. So they sat, and there was a chair for Erich. So Baba then asks Erich to tell me of what he had been going through in his seclusion. And Erich narrates then to me that Baba has been pounding his right hand on his right knee for several days in seclusion in order to do his universal work. And if he did not do that, his body would snap and that he would not be alive. And would I like to massage his leg? So I took that opportunity of massaging his leg, and when I touched his leg, his thigh, it was as if I was touching this piece of glass or this piece of wall. It was hard as a rock. And Baba could barely move his fingers, but he did explain very gradually. So there were two issues that had to be, as I mentioned to you, every single decision we ran to him. We ran to take his advice. In this case, it was there were two decisions to be taken. One was about a job. There were 3 jobs. Which one should I take? The Army and the Air Force paid well. I remember that my salary would have started at 800 rupees, which was a princely sum at that time. And my Times of India job was 400 rupees. As all journalists will testify, you're not paid too much. And it was 400 rupees. So here the question came up is, should I take a job that's paying a lot more, or should I take a job that's paying very little? So that was my dilemma. So Baba turns to the 3 to 4 different people sitting there. One person happened to be an uncle of mine. So he says, what do you say? He says, Baba, he's always been very fond of the army, because I was for 3 years undergoing training in the army. So says he's always been very fond of the army. Perhaps he'd like to join the army. Somebody said, Baba, Air Force is a great job, and you're flying around and so forth. Then somebody else said, Baba, he's been doing the glow, he's been writing, he's been perhaps Times of India should be good. So they gave their opinions. Then he turns to me and says, what would you like to join? What would you like to do? And I had decided in my mind that I'm not going to give an opinion. So he says, I said, Baba, whatever you say. So he stops for a moment and then he says, join the Times, which was the lowest paid job. Then he moves his fingers and somebody says, but don't change your mind. And Baba says, no, that's not what he said. Then he again gently moves his fingers. He was very, very sick at that time.
A small movement could precipitate
a spasm.
Right.
So he again moves his fingers, and somebody else says, don't dilly-dally in your decision. Baba says, no, that was not what he said. Then very painfully, Baba moves his fingers, spelling out the alphabet. And the word was vacillate. Don't vacillate. It was a huge, huge experience for me about how important Baba emphasized each word. And today sometimes there's a controversy that maybe a disciple came up with a discourse, or maybe somebody wrote under Baba's name. Not true. Every word that has come out under Meher Baba's name was given out by Meher Baba under his name, and this proved it. It could very well have been, don't change your mind. It could very well have meant, don't dilly-dally in your decision. But no, he had to use the word vacillate. Don't vacillate. Then as I go forward, we talked about the glow. And Baba then said that the glow was my infant and that I must nurture it well. And it's been 38 years since he has been the editor-in-chief, and I've been able to bring it out every quarter. We started it in 1965. 66 February was the first issue. 65 was the first issue of Spark, and which of course we couldn't use the name, and then the Glow. And it has its trials and tribulations, its vicissitudes, but Meher Baba has made sure that it comes out every quarter. And that's because of this mandate that he's given us. And that's why we gave birth to Beloved Archives, which is an archive that we've set up. which I would dare say is the largest outside of India, and we're now putting it all together. It's a non-profit tax-exempt corporation, the Beloved Archives. We're looking for a place to house it at the moment. We are working with the Conservation Center of Philadelphia to house thousands and thousands of paper, of documents that we have, several thousand photographs, over 3,000 photographs, over 1,000 cassettes, which some of them we have converted some of the old tapes into CDs. So a lot of work is generating as a result of the mandate that Meher Baba has given me. Before I left his room, I embrace him, I kiss him on both the cheeks. He does not kiss me back. I kiss him. Irich said that you were very fortunate. Baba has not allowed anyone to embrace him for a very long time. And then Baba again moves his fingers and he tells me, my time has come. I don't know what to make of it. Then I go out, and then there's a very slight clap, and Irich takes me back in. And Baba says, my time has come. And then I go out. I have no recollection of anything that I may have thought about that, what he meant. I will end this session with my last story. I left the place. 40 days later, the morning of my first day of my first job, Times of India. It was in the morning around 8 o'clock. Telephone call from a friend of mine. Have you read this morning's Times of India? No, I haven't. It's still under the door. Go and pick it up. She wouldn't tell me what was in the Times of India. I go to I put the telephone down, bring the newspaper, and there on the front page was a photograph of Meher Baba with his eyes closed, and below it was written, Meher Baba found dead in a cave. Now, it was not beyond the realm of impossibility because Meher Baba would often go and sit in caves in seclusion. But apparently, the reporter had wrongly written it. He had probably gone into the tomb. There's the tomb that had been constructed in 1938, and that had rocks all over. And for some odd reason, for some strange reason, this is the title that came on. I was stunned. I was shocked. My immediate thought, what will I do now? It was a selfish thought, but a thought that said, what will I do now? So I thanked the lady, put the phone down. It was my first day of my first job. I was wearing a suit at that time. I had already got dressed. It was a very thin summer suit. I went to work and I go into my boss's office and I tell him, I say, good morning, sir, but I have to leave. I said, I presume you've seen the Times of India this morning. My master has passed away. Now in India, people understand when you talk about spiritual masters. He says, when will you be back? I said, sir, I really don't know, but should be in a day or so. So, I mean, it was something that he was also taken aback, that here is a man that I've selected him, and here he's coming and telling me that he's leaving to go away on the very first day of his first job. I mean, very first day. But then I took the train and I was off to Ahmednagar. I reached there at night. I had nothing with me except some money and some my ticket, and I was wearing the suit. I land at night at about 10:30, 11, and Ahmednagar station was deserted. I suddenly see a Tonga, a one-horse carriage, and I ask him to take me to Mehrabad. This was my first visit to Mehrabad. I had never been to Mehrabad. So I go there, this Tonga takes me, and I don't see any cars, I don't see any people. In those days, that entire stretch that you now see is jammed to the gills was empty. There was no traffic. Nobody went to Ahmednagar. Nobody went to Mehrabad or Aramgaon. It was a road that connected on to Y and to other places. So as I come, the man tells me that that's Mehrabad. That's the place, because they knew about Meher Baba, the Tonga man. I don't see a soul in Lower Mehrabad. I don't see a soul up on the hill. I could see a shadowy building up on top, which was the tomb, and of course the water tank. At that moment, I was certain that the paper was wrong, that there was something wrong about the story. There got to be people here. No one is over here. So I walk up. It was freezing cold. It was very cold. So I walk up the hill, and I see in the distance a glittering light, just the light of a lamp. And as I go closer, I see some people sitting there. They look like villagers they were villagers from Arangaon. And I see one man with a quilt covering his body. So as I go closer, this man lifts the quilt up, and I see it's Irach. So Irach says, "Oh, Naosherwan, you've come?" I said, "Yes, Irach." And he, I don't know what to say, but I say something really stupid, and I say that, "Has Meher Baba broken his silence?" And he says, "No." He says, "But go inside before the crowd start coming. Go into the tomb and sit with Baba." So in those days, you didn't have this canopy that you have today. You had meditation cells and so forth. So I go in. He gives me his flashlight. So I go in, I close this heavy door that is still there. And there's Baba in the tomb, in the crypt. And I go down the steps. Now you don't see those steps, but there were 2 steps. And then there was the crypt. So I go down and I sit on the steps. You may have seen pictures of people sitting at the edge of the steps. So I go down and I hold his feet, and I keep repeating again and again, "What will happen to me, Baba? What will happen to me?" And it was a feeling of frustration, a feeling of depression, a feeling of tremendous sadness, remorse, heaviness, a load on my shoulders. And I would put the flashlight on his face, then sit down again, repeating his name, thinking of my last meeting with him. At that moment, I took a pledge on his body and said that I would write his biography, which, even though it took me 4 years, I completed it and it was published. That was all that I wanted to offer him, something, and that was what I offered him, a pledge that I would write his biography. So I would sit and keep on looking at his face, and remove the torchlight. See his face and turn the flashlight. At one point, I point the flashlight on his face and I see his eyes open. All I can say is, Baba. I turn the flashlight away and I take it quickly back and I see that his eyes were closed. At that moment, it was as if this heavy load had come off my shoulders. And that thought, what will I do now, has never come to me again. What will happen to me has never happened. But at that time, I felt that Baba was telling me that I never leave you. I'm always with you. And this is a message that I want to share with you, that he never, ever, ever leaves you. He's always with you. With Meher Baba, please remember, life is difficult. Without Meher Baba, life is impossible. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. I'd like to make a short announcement. Naosherwan has been kind enough to bring free copies of this book. Would you like to just say a couple of words about this, Naosherwan?
Yes. This book has a short story. It was many years later in the 70s, when once again Baba's separation continued to hound me, and I became quite sick. And one day I was in the afternoon lying on my bed when suddenly I had a dream in the afternoon in which Baba asks me to get up and write. And I wrote down as much as I could without having a thought of what I was writing. I wrote it down, and when I finished writing this, I felt that Baba was giving me a message that I should share. But I didn't have any other thought except that this was something that Baba had given me and that I should put it aside. I sent it to somebody in the United States over here, and they analyzed this writing as piece of automatic writing, as they call it. And I finally, after many, many years, after I came to the United States to live here, I felt that I think now is the time for me to share this message with people. And I published this book myself. I wanted to print it in the form of a pearl in an oyster. So it's been designed that way. But I feel that the message that is contained in this book has a greater significance today than it was in the 70s when Baba gave it to me. So please read it, enjoy it, and see what you can take away from it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming.
Jai
Jai
Baba.
Meher Baba. Have a good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Questions asked?
Well, if Alex will permit, if you're going to ask questions, though, because of the situation with the camera and the microphones, please keep them very brief, and I'll repeat them for the microphone so that we have a record of it.
This is about finished.
It's almost finished? Okay.
I mean, if you
So,
want to change. the
Ira?
date, you
Naosherwan, we started talking over dinner, and you informed me that you and your mother had taken a trip to explore more deeply the origins of Sharia Irani, Meher Baba's father. Could you please elaborate more of what you discovered and what was revealed to you that was particularly significant about Meher Baba's father?
Well, in 1976, my mother and I went to Iran to research Meher Baba's ancestry. And while the story is very, very long, because we traveled quite a bit, we went to all the places associated with Meher Baba's father, Shehryar Mondegar Irani. We went to his to the home that he lived in. We also went to the home of Shehryar's father, which is now in a dilapidated condition. Both he and his father looked after, they were keepers of the Tower of Silence, and they then finally, he was a mystic, his father was a mystic, so he left his work and then went away, and nobody ever heard of him till they found that he had come to Pune and came to India. So we went to a number of places associated with his life. And the reason why the story is very long is because when the Muslims invaded Iran and took over, as you are aware, history tells us that the Zoroastrians ruled over Iran for a number of years, and that the Muslim hordes came and drove them away when they came and took asylum in India and various other parts of the world. This particular area of Yazd and Khorramshahr, where they lived, Parsis had suffered the worst, the Zoroastrians had suffered the worst. They were not allowed to carry an umbrella. They were not allowed to wear shoes. They had to wear a different kind of stockings and so forth. They were humiliated a lot. They were persecuted. They were not allowed to follow their religion. They were converted to Islam under the threat of being killed. So a lot of them had converted themselves but were still wearing the Zoroastrian symbols of Sadra and Kasti inside their robes. So when I went into this town of Khorramshahr, please don't mistake it with Khorramshahr, which is a seaport. This is Khorramshahr, which is near Yazd. We were told, people asked, who are these people who have come from Tehran? We had come from Tehran. And they said that they've come from Tehran, so we were looked at suspiciously. But when we were told that they are followers of Meher Baba, people relaxed a little bit. In fact, the fire temple, we wanted to go and see a fire temple, and we were told that it's locked, and fire temples are never locked. They're always open for people to come in. So it was, people whispered with each other. It's a very small little village. They wondered who these people were. But we were not there just to be in Khorramshahr. Of course, that's where I did my research. We also were very anxious to go to a place called Jafrabad, which Meher Baba had visited for one night in 1929. It was the home of one of his disciples called Baidul. And when we had to go to another small village because nobody really knew where to go, how to find Jafrabad. But there was a young student, a student of the